going to have a great session with first Devashish telling us about occupational mobility in a country that has become a model or kind of a poster child for development through trade, which is Vietnam. And then we'll have Roman talking about trade liberalization, impacts on wage inequality in Latin America. And we have two great discussants. So the rules are the same, 40 minutes for presentation, then 10 minutes for the discussant, and then questions afterwards, unless it's a very pressing clarification question. So let's get started.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you to the selection committee for putting our paper on the program. As you can see, this is a much shorter title than the one on the program. We shortened it quite a bit. This paper is co-authored with Hoang Pham, who's at Oregon State University, and Beyza Ural-Marchand, who's at University of Alberta. So, this paper is about the impact of trade on intergenerational mobility, which basically means the extent to which socioeconomic status is able to change across generations. Whether if there are barriers to that, there's lower mobility. If the barriers are lower, there's higher mobility. So, this is an important question in development. As a World Bank report, there's a quote from there, economic mobility across generations is a key element of human progress and therefore also of development. And basically what it allows is basically more efficient human capital formation and allocation, right? So if there are less barriers to mobility, or if people can easily jump those barriers, then it is easier for the high ability people to acquire more human capital and be placed in appropriate jobs. It also affects, as a paper by Alesina and his co-authors argues, it also affects the preferences for redistribution, right? So if there is mobility, then there might be, people might not want a lot of redistribution because there is this, you need the incentives to kind of move to higher ranked occupations. So what we focus on is kind of a natural experiment here, in the sense that there was a US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement in 2001, and that allows us to look at the impact of that on intergenerational mobility, where the bigger export markets that led to export expansion led to intergenerational occupational mobility, because now you had basically better jobs available in these export sectors. So we're going to emphasize some mechanisms here. Those mechanisms include skill demand, educational attainment, and so on. And we are also going to emphasize the gender dimension, unlike in many of the papers in the literature. Actually, in trade, there's just a couple of papers on intergenerational mobility, but there is a broader literature on intergenerational mobility. So, and you can see there's a literature in labor and public, pioneered by Raj Chetty, and there's Long and Ferry, and many others. In the trade literature, we only have 2 papers so far that we are aware of. One is by Hassan and Chatterjee, which looks at the impact of import competition on intergenerational mobility in India, then a more recent paper is on the U.S. by Colantone, Ottaviano, and Takeda. So what we what we've done is both these papers focus on import competition. We are looking at export expansion. We are looking at the opportunities provided by the US-Vietnam trade agreement, bilateral trade agreement to households in Vietnam, and how that affects mobility. But we also, unlike these two papers, we actually, our focus is not just absolute mobility, but also relative mobility. And the difference between the two I will explain in a few minutes. We also look at the gender dimension. Our empirical design is also a little different, as you'll see. There's also, now, this paper is as much on the impact of trade on occupational mobility, intergenerational occupational mobility, as much on the impact of trade on Vietnam. There's a big literature on Vietnam and the BTA, between Vietnam and the US, mainly by Brian McCaig and Nina Pauchnik. There's another paper by Foucasse. So I'll end the literature review there. It's just a 40-minute presentation. In terms of trade reforms, Vietnam already had quite a bit of unilateral trade reforms in 1986. The Doi Moi reforms, which basically moved Vietnam from a market economy to from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. And they also liberalized trade quite a bit. Earlier trade was just, foreign trade was carried out by just a few state-owned monopolies, but they moved it to the private sector, liberalized trade, reduced tariffs quite a bit. But the US-Vietnam BTA, the bilateral trade agreement, was implemented in December 2001. So we can think of that happening around 2002. Now the US, what the US did was it just moved Vietnam from column 2 to column 1 tariffs, from column 2, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, to the MFN tariffs, right? So the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were, determined in the early 1930s, and the MFN, the Uruguay round tariffs, in the early 90s. So these two tariff vectors are pretty exogenous to what's happening in this experiment that we are looking at. And so if you look at US tariffs on Vietnam, they went down from about 23% to about 2.5%. And the tariff reductions were mostly on manufacturing. Vietnam's exports to the US were about $1 billion, slightly over $1 billion. They, by 2016, which is basically our sample period, increased to $43.6 billion. So now Vietnam also liberalizes tariffs, but as I mentioned, a lot of the tariff reduction was already done. There was Vietnam's accession to the WTO happened in 2007. So the average Vietnam tariff rates decreased from 17% to 9% during the 1998 to 2016 period. We actually control for that, look at the effects of these tariff changes, as well as see whether controlling for these tariffs has any impact on the BTA effects. We don't find any impact of this tariff, and that the introducing these tariffs doesn't affect the impact of the BTA. So if you look at exports, you can clearly see that you can clearly see that this just took off after 2001. Exports, especially manufacturing exports, and that drove total exports as well. If we look at 10-digit level exports, and we see the impact of this BTA tariff change, which is column 1 minus column 2. Remember, this is going to be a negative number. So if you have a negative coefficient, it shows a positive impact, negative theta here. It shows a positive impact of the BTA, and you can clearly see the effect here. So, and during the sample period, this effect totally remains, if you look at the 90% confidence interval, that it totally remains below 0, which means we can say with high confidence that this did have a positive effect on exports, Vietnamese exports to the US. All right. So we are going to be looking at absolute mobility. Basically, it's the share of children that have better occupations than their parents. All right. So, and we are also going to look at relative mobility. Basically, those are what is the relative status of the children within their population, and whether that is any different from the status that their parents had within their population, right? And that basically is kind of the intergenerational analog of poverty versus inequality. If you see, greater absolute mobility, it's kind of like poverty reduction, right? And if you see higher relative mobility, it's like reduction in inequality. So, and we'll see how the two results, whether the two results go in the same direction or in the opposite direction. But a lot of the theory that we think about to guide our empirical analysis and to even explain our results are based on the Stolper-Samuelson effects within the Heckscher-Ohlin model. So one could think of Vietnam falling in the diversification cone, where they specialize in light manufactures and agricultural products. Given that most of the and the U.S. basically in the specialization cone with heavy manufacturing and advanced services. So most of the tariff reductions by the U.S. were on manufacture, so we can expect that the relative price of light manufactures that Vietnam faced would rise relative to agriculture, basically bigger markets for their light manufacturers, and that would basically increase the demand for human capital, the demand for high-skilled labor, which are high-skilled by Vietnamese standards, but might not be high-skilled by American standards. So that increases, that increase in demand will lead to a higher high-skilled wage, and the effect could be the opposite on low-skilled wage, and that could drive more human capital formation and an increase in absolute mobility. The question is whether it also leads to an increase in relative mobility, and we'll see in a few minutes what happens. So we have 8 rounds of the Vietnam Household Living Standards Survey data, VHLSS, spanning between 01, 02, and 2015, 2016. They are nationally representative, conducted every 2 years with a 12-month recall period. We will use son and father samples and daughter and mother pair samples. It's going to be different from the existing literature that is focused mainly on sons versus fathers, right? So sons was, we are going to compare sons with their fathers, daughters with their mothers. In fact, often we cannot track who the mother is. In some cases, it'll be the mother-in-law, but in those societies, we believe that the social status would be similar. and occupational ranks also would be similar for mothers and mothers-in-law. So that's the only way out, and so we do it that way. But we will just call them mothers. Now, and the children and the parents are contemporarily participating in the labor market. Our trade data, tariff data, the BTA tariff data come from McCaig and Parchnik, and we have all these HS 10-digit flows from the US Census and other tariff data from WITS. So how do we do the ranking of occupations? We look at the education level of an individual in occupation, individual I in occupation O, province P in year T, and then we regress that on a bunch of individual characteristics like age, age squared, gender, and so on, and then we get a bunch of fixed effects. We have province by time, and then we have the occupation fixed effects. So once we get the occupation fixed effects, we can actually rank these occupations. So, so rankings are highly stable. Our ranking, the ranking that we use in our regressions are at the 2-digit occupational codes of the ISCO. But here, just to make things clear, we are showing you our 1-digit ones. In an earlier version of the paper, we used 1-digit occupation codes, but we got comments that maybe it's good to go a bit disaggregate. More on that a little later. But you can clearly see we do 2 samples, right, for 2 different periods, and the occupation ranks are preserved, no change. We also do, pairwise comparisons, of these, occupation ranks. We do pairwise t-tests, and these rankings actually indeed pass the pairwise t-tests. So I can show you also the 2-digit version of this, and you can see that we do it for 2 separate periods, 2001 to 7 and 2009 to 16, and it's, they're again pretty stable, but this is much easier to see. Yeah.
Question about the data. So you're able to observe these pairs also for children who moved out of the household, or only for cohabitating children?
Cohabitating children, but I'm going to come to that. So there could be a sample selection problem with that. So what we do is we look at households where children are the head of the household, so that use that as an indicator, and then see whether the children being head of the household, being household head is purely determined by age. So children being household head means that they are living separately from their parents, and that we find is is not being affected by our BTA variable. So that's the kind of test we do to see whether this is kind of endogenous to what's going on with the BTA or not. We can talk about this later. But so I think if there was some kind of endogeneity there, we would be very concerned. But given that it doesn't have any effect, we are less concerned. So if you look at absolute mobility here, it has been going up over time, both for sons and daughters, and the gap was greater between sons and daughters in terms of mobility, 13% and then 13% for daughters, 17% for sons. They've come much closer. So we are now at about 26 and 24 by 2015. but mobility has been going up. So upward mobility is being defined as, this indicator variable is going to be 1 if child's occupation is ranked higher than parents. I explained to you how we rank occupations, 0 otherwise. So we can do this by cohort. These are basically 20% of sample each. That's why we divide it this way. And these are basically, you can see what their age will be by 2001. You can see that cohorts that are 18 and the moment any cohort starts turning 18 or 19, that's when we start seeing the upward mobility. So we can see that 2 of the samples, after 89 sample, 86 to 89, they constantly, for the whole period, apart from the first couple of years, start showing so 2005 onwards is one sample, and then 2007 onwards is the other sample. So remember that a lot of the identification we will get from these age groups is when they start working, right? When the son is working or the daughter is working, then only that age group will be part of the sample. So the identification totally comes from when these people start working, right? And the age restriction in our sample is 15 to 40 for both sons and daughters, for obvious reasons. Parents might be retired or dead, so it's it makes sense to put that age restriction, 15 to 40. So we use the local labor markets approach. So we look at province level BTA exposure. We have 2-digit tariffs, the MFN and column 2. And once we get for these tariffs, what we do is we get a weighted average for the province, and we restrict ourselves to traded goods, following work by Kovac, who showed theoretically that the best approach is to use just the traded sectors. We have here shifts. The tariff changes would be the shifts, and the shares would be all the the employment shares of different industries within a province. So from here what the shifts are and what the shares are in our analysis. And this is the map of Vietnam, and you can see that the darker regions are the ones that got the biggest tariff cuts, the weighted tariff cuts that I just mentioned, right? So Ho Chi Minh City is certainly one of them, that area. And then you're probably familiar with Hanoi, and Hanoi probably would be in the second category for some reason. But my knowledge of the map of Vietnam is not very good, but for those who know the map of Vietnam well, you can get some information from here. We have a baseline model here. So you saw our definition of upward mobility. 1, if the child's occupation is better than the parents, and 0 otherwise. And we have a post-BTA dummy. After 2001, it becomes 1. Prior to that is 0. And that is interacted with this tariff cut, the BTA tariff cut, which is at the province level. And in all our regressions, we control for age squared, father's or mother's age, father's or mother's age square, marital status, urban status, urban or rural, whether the person belongs to minority, household size, share of male members within the household, and so on. And the lambda P and lambda T, the province and year effects respectively. Now, if we are not using, we are also going to be doing this regression by cohort. So you can see the effects can be by different cohorts, and the other control variables are the same. We also have the Vietnam tariff here, right? Vietnam's tariff on imports from the rest of the world, which keeps changing over time. And one thing to remember here is that one could think of doing cohort by year fixed effects, but that kind of kills a lot of the variation in the data. And so the way we did it was by controlling age and age squared, which would basically attack the same problem with minimum loss in the degrees of freedom, right? And also allowing for enough variation for us to identify the effect of the BTA. So the sources of identification, there's variation across provinces and over time in the proportion of sons or daughters going to higher ranked occupations. I already talked about the shift and the share. The shift is basically the tariff changes. We believe it's exogenous. Why? Because the column 2 tariffs were determined in the early 1930s, the column 1 tariffs in the early 1990s, way before the BTA, and the shares are lagged, shares in 1999 before the BTA. So if we look at our first set of results, this is for sons versus fathers, sons relative to fathers. You see that if in our most basic regression, the sign is correct, but you'll see that they are insignificant. The coefficients are insignificant, and why are they? So therefore, we cannot have much confidence in that negative sign, right? So we look at what is behind this no effect result, and so we do the regression by where we divide the sample into cohorts, right, which I talked about, and you can see that this base effect is basically would represent the older cohorts, right, those born before 1979. And we see basically no effect for them, and then a differential effect for the younger cohorts. Now, if we add the first two terms, the effect is this effect here is, we find that to be insignificant. But when we add the base term with the cohort specific term for the others, all these effects are negative and significant, meaning that for cohorts 83 to 86 and 86 to 89, we can be confident that they have for them the BTA has a positive impact on their mobility, and this is relative to the counterfactual of no BTA. All right, whether we control for the Vietnam tariffs or not doesn't matter. What we find is that for these groups, the impact of the BTA for them is about a third of the increase in mobility that they see over this sample period, and it's half of the overall increase in mobility that we see. So it's quite a big effect in our opinion. If we could also, instead of doing interactions with cohorts, we could also do interactions by age and age square, and then we get this nice U-shaped graph showing the effects along with their confidence intervals. And we basically see that the impact of the BTA, the positive impact of the BTA, shown by a negative coefficient, is basically we can be confident of that for the age group 24 to 30, right? That's when people see this increase in upward mobility. So now there are many channels one can think of. The first thing we think of is that, if there is a BTA with the US, then basically they'll have to be exporting high quality goods. So the higher end products are the ones that will be benefiting. Those are the ones that will be exported to the US. Or there could also be some quality upgradation. Both will lead to an increase in the demand for skills, like moving the composition to higher end goods, and given goods, you increase the skill level for higher quality. Both will lead to increase in demand for human capital. We find that the impact of BTA on exports is 90% through volume, right? And for basically quantity of exports, only 10% is is through quality upgrading, right? Which is captured by unit value in our analysis. Relative demand for high-skilled occupations, we find has gone up, and if you look at this, we run this, we based on our occupational our ranking of occupations, we construct high-skilled share, low-skilled share, and medium-skilled share. When we run this regression at the industry level, we don't find any effect, but when we run it at the province level, the effects are very significant. Again, negative sign means a positive impact of the BTA, which clearly says that there is a compositional effect, that we are moving from lower skilled industries to higher skilled industries, right? We also look at wages, right? Residual wages after controlling for all the demographic characteristics. And if you look at this, you will see again that the beneficial impact of the BTA is on high-skilled wages, high-skilled residual hourly wage, and medium-skilled residual hourly wage, and no effect on low skill for men. But then this positive means that the low skill wage actually goes down for women. This is pretty consistent with the Stolper-Samuelson effect, putting Vietnam in the lower diversification cone of light manufacturers and agriculture. So this Stolper-Samuelson effect, you will see that will play an important role in relative mobility as well. We also look at initial educational levels. We find BTA effects vary by initial educational levels, both provincial and individual. Higher education, provincial and individual levels leads to more mobility as a result of the BTA. And so we have a bunch of regressions in the paper. I won't go through them. And BTA also has effects on educational attainment, decreases the probability of having only a secondary school diploma, but increases the probability of college and vocational training for sons, and college training for daughters. So we do all these, look at all these channels. I'm going to move quickly to relative mobility. Relative mobility basically is looking at the inverse rank gradient. So if your if the son's education is highly sensitive to the father's education, that's showing a lack of mobility, right? If the slope is high, that slope is high, this lack of mobility. So if that is flatter, then there is more mobility. So what we do is we regress child rank on parent rank, and then the obvious BTA interactions. Of course, the BTA variables by themselves as well, right? So I'm going to quickly move to this. You can see that there is, from a the first regression, you can clearly see that there is lack of mobility. There's some mobility, but there is some degree of lack of mobility. You look at the triple interaction term and in the second column, and it shows you that this mobility actually goes down because the BTA is actually increasing the slope. Remember, negative means positive impact of the BTA. So it actually increases the slope of this rank coefficient, and that means the BTA is reducing relative mobility. And you can see that for some of the younger cohorts, what's happening is actually the reduction in relative mobility is lower. In fact, these two here, these cohorts, they cancel out with the base effect, so there's no impact on their mobility. While the base effect, and then out here you can see that these groups, their reduction in mobility is not basically no different from the rest of the population, the older population. Okay, so daughters, similar result. Mobility goes down. For the younger groups, the mobility either doesn't go down as much, or actually for the youngest two groups, there's no change in their mobility. All right. So what are we finding? We are actually finding that the BTA led to an increase in absolute mobility, but actually a reduction in absolute mobility, or for the younger groups, no change in reduction in relative mobility, or for the youngest groups, no change in mobility. So now we move to income mobility. We did occupational mobility. Income mobility, the data are not that great because agricultural wage data are not very good. So this is just exploratory. We do see an increase in absolute income mobility for sons, but not for daughters. That can be explained by a number of things. We don't have a clear answer to that. It could just be that they reduce their work hours after getting this better job, or it could just be gender discrimination. It could be a bunch of other reasons. But we really don't have much data on that. We also look at, relative mobility. There seems to be low relative mobility in terms of, it's not at least perfect relative mobility in terms of incomes. But again, we should not rely on the intergenerational income mobility results too much, because the data are not complete and they are not reliable in our opinion. So I'll just conclude. So we've studied the effect of this export expansion coming through the BTA on intergenerational mobility in Vietnam. And while the BTA improves absolute occupational mobility, which is an intergenerational analog of poverty reduction, but relative mobility either goes down or remains the same, which is basically saying that it's the intergenerational analog of inequality either rising or not changing. So we explore different mechanisms here: skill demand, resource allocation across sectors, educational attainment, and so on. And within exports, we also see whether it's primarily driven by quality upgradation or increase in the volumes of exports. From our results, it seems that it probably is a compositional change in terms of what people are producing. I also want to mention that if you look at our empirical results on wages, the Stolper-Samuelson effects are there, and we've shown that, and those are very crucial both for results on relative mobility as well as absolute mobility. Relative mobility is explained by a model by Becker and his co-authors, which basically says that parents' human capital and how much they invest in education are complementary inputs in the child's education or human capital production function, along with the fact that the earnings function becomes more convex as a result of trade, meaning people at the high, at high human capital levels are the ones that get much bigger proportional returns. This kind of explains our relative mobility results as well. So I'm going to stop there, but there are some policy implications which are obvious: increase export market access, but also, make access to education more equal, access to training opportunities more equal, and it's only then that you get the maximum beneficial impact of trade. And there need to be changes in social norms too about what occupations are good for women and what are not, and so on. Effect of trade. These are the changes that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. First of all, thank you so much, organizers, for letting me discuss this paper. It's very rich in terms of the outcomes and analysis done, and I learned a lot reading it. So before I start, let me do a quick recap of everything that just was presented. So the paper is about the effects of US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement, which led to reduction in US import tariffs on occupational intergenerational mobility. And the way it's designed, it's exploit variation in initial composition of industries. It's kind of shift share Bartik type of analysis on various outcomes. And the outcomes that were studied is first absolute mobility for both fathers and sons and mothers and daughters. So there is this gender aspect in the paper. Then they're doing this for different birth cohorts, arguing that it might be different depending on which age and where you're in terms of the labor market. Then across and within sectors, then they're also looking at the effects on education and educational investment, and finally on the relative mobility and income mobility. So what I can say is impressive data work. It's a lot of outcomes. The paper has 10 sections, and so it took me a while to digest between them. And here I'll try to summarize the results, which I think very important for the later discussion. So what they find that there is no significant effect on overall population when we think about this absolute mobility in terms of the occupations for both sons and daughters, but the devil in the details. So what they find that there is heterogeneity across cohorts with positive effects of expansion in exports for some of them. Then there are similar results for both genders, which would be important. However, the difference or the surprising outcomes that there is a negative for the relative mobility, meaning that this increase in exposure to exports, moving some people into higher ranked occupations, but not overall increasing them, not for the lowest or poorest population. Then they explored also potential mechanism and what I call not really mechanism, other variables. And so what has been found that the demand for higher skilled labor increased across industries, but not within the industry, so the composition of the industry doesn't change really much. Then there is an increase in supply of high skilled labor, basically through the channel of education. And finally, they find that there is an increase in the wage, but for some jobs and for some genders. And in terms of the income mobility, there is increase in absolute income mobility, but not for all genders. Okay? So the way I want to structure my today's discussion is first I'm going to talk about the main empirical exercise, then I'm going to cover this mechanism and various variables, and finally I will conclude with the big picture. And as I already mentioned, the paper kind of studies a lot of various outcomes, and therefore, when I do my discussion, I will focus only on the like in details on the main empirical exercise, and all about other mechanisms and variables I'm gonna talk a little bit more broadly, more of a big picture. So the first one is what I call PD comments, which doesn't mean they're not important. It's an empirical paper, but I think they're relatively easy to address. And so I'm going to go through them very briefly, and some of them actually partially addressed in the paper, but I think a little bit more careful work is needed in order to make this robust conclusion. The first one is very simple. It's the selection. The sample is restricted to pairs that co-reside with each other. Also that both of them are employed and also like on their children and in-laws. And as I mentioned, there are some of the robustness were done, but can be done more. So there needs to be some additional exercises to confirm that this kind of selection of the sample is not driving the result. Second, in terms of the ranking of occupations, what the authors currently doing, they're looking at the post-reform ranking of the occupations. So again, there was some compositional change. Yes, the ranking didn't change, but you could see that clearly there is some skills intensity changing over the time. So what I suggest, you go to the earlier data in order to rank all of this pre-reform. Finally, which I think like one of the most important is to address whether there are any pretense or other major reforms. And one example that is studied in the paper is access to WTO in 2007, but also there was a huge market liberalization in 90s in Vietnam, and I'm sure the authors know about the country way more, but there is a huge difference between South and North Vietnam because of 1954 division of the country into two countries. And if we look at this map, actually, you could see clearly that the exposure is very different in the South and in the North, with exception of the capital, Hanoi. So I think it's really important to think about all this episode of liberalization happening prior this US trade agreement. Finally, this is like very simple comments. There is like certain way they compute the exposure measure, which wasn't very obvious why it's log 1 plus the tariff. And finally, the paper focused only on upward mobility. And I was wondering what's going on if we also compute effects on the downward mobility, and I'm going to return to this comment a little bit later when I talk about the big picture. Okay, so now let me give a little bit more details on the main exercise of the paper and what they're looking at the upward mobility or effect of the increase in export exposure on the upward mobility. And if we go on the results, and I'm here putting sons and fathers, the results are very similar for mothers and daughters. So what we can see, if we take the overall population, it's actually, the result goes in the right direction, but it's insignificant. Therefore, the author's saying maybe it's because not everyone yet were exposed to the labor markets, and they going by the cohorts. So one simple comment that I think was a little bit addressed during the presentation, that I think that if we really want to talk about the exposure, we need to include the cohort time effect, in order to make sure that these results are not driven by simply different trend of each of the cohort. But what I want to here to point out, and this is kind of the very broad big picture comment for the entire paper, I think there are many moving pieces in the paper, many various outcomes, and sometimes it would be very, like for the reader, it would be really helpful if you kind of could synthesize it into one big picture. So here, like I'm showing you example, I roughly calculated the average age of each cohort that were studied in a given being. And so if we look here at the outcome, the effect is negative or positive in terms of like higher export exposure leads to higher upward mobility. For somebody who was 20 years old and somebody who was 19 years old on average during this period of time. But then the author's doing some extra robustness check, which is in appendix, and maybe it wasn't fair for me to go to the appendix, but if we look for a little bit reduced sample and look at the results for the same equivalent ages, they're quite different. And even more, if we look at those who below 16 years old during this sample period, the effect is actually going into opposite direction. And again, I'm not saying that it's inconsistent, but like a little bit more explanation. What is going on here? Shall we include this sample overall? Can we talk about occupational mobility of somebody who is 16 years old compared to the father who is like 50 years old? So I think like putting together a little bit of this would really help. And this is coming to my big kind of comment on the mechanism and other variables. Again, this was done a lot of work on various channels, but evidence is mixed. And I think like giving the reader a little bit the big picture and synthesize all of this would be very helpful. And when I say synthesize, because once we look at the results, it's like, it's positive for absolute mobility, but not for the relative. The effect is positive for some cohorts, but not for others. Again, there is demand for high-skilled labor across industries, but not within, and so on. So maybe like narrowing down focus with more details on a given channel or heterogeneity would actually make the paper stronger. So this would be one of my suggestions. The second one, if we think about the mechanism, there are two mechanisms that were explored in the paper. One is that exposure to export market increase the demand for high-skilled labor. But then if we look at the analysis that has been done in the paper, they look at the regressions or within a given industry or within a given province. So here, I think it's a very interesting object to study, but how does it link to occupational mobility if we think about the paper as a whole? The second one is the supply channel. Again, there was some results on educational outcomes or inclusion of these educational controls, but again, they were not really directly linked to the occupational mobility. So I think the paper would really benefit if you use those dimensions, which are really important, but to kind of put them together with the title of the paper, you just use those dimensions to divide the sample, similar how you're doing in terms of the gender, and see whether for different types or different levels of education, for example, there is effect or there are no effect. And finally, this is like my almost last slide. What is the big picture kind of thing? And I think I already alluded a little bit of what's going on, but I think, and this is maybe just my own preference, the title of the paper, The Effect of Export Expansion on Occupational Intergenerational Mobility. But for me, it looks like it's a paper more about sectorial composition, what the effect in sectorial composition, but maybe just semantic and maybe my own preference. But like why I'm thinking this way, because if we look what paper does, it looks only on upward mobility. If we want to talk about mobility, probably we should also think about downward mobility as well, whether there are any changes. And also, if we look at the relative mobility of what the paper does, it's actually the opposite message about mobility, the word mobility. Again, this might be just semantic and my own preference, but I think like thinking about the theme is very important. Finally, it's really important also to kind of position this paper in the literature. There is a little bit similar work. The authors clearly citing this work, but a little bit showing what is the difference between the papers mentioned would be very helpful as well to know how the settings that you study is different. And finally, on my final thoughts, again, very impressive data work, a lot of outcomes. For me, what is the most interesting and exciting part was that there are many non-obvious results and not as expected and not in line with at least my own priors. Like the example would be that occupational mobility increased for both genders, but income mobility only for males. This is not trivial why this is a case. The second one, which I was very intrigued, was occupational mobility not driven by family where parent is in agriculture, because this is what I would thought initially, given the history of Vietnam, that all of this is driven by those who are moving from agriculture to other sectors. But indeed, there are some results in the appendix that shows that this is not the case. So I think there is a lot of potential to push the paper because there are many results that are very novel, ex ante, not expected, but maybe narrowing the focus and addressing empirical concerns could actually make the paper a very big contribution to the literature. And I went a little bit over time.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much. So we're going to be able to take some questions, and I will abuse my position and ask the first question. Maybe I should have asked during the...
Answer to the comments?
If you If you want, or you maybe gather. Okay, if you want to answer.
All right. Excellent comments. I have just a few responses to certain comments. The downward mobility issue in a previous version of the paper, where we used one-digit occupational codes, we found that there was no impact of the BTA on downward mobility. I already talked about what we do about cohort time effects. We control for age and age square, and we believe that should control for it. But that's something worth trying for sure. As I said, we expect that to kill a lot of the variation in the data, which will prevent our identification. And the shorter sample that Kristina showed, one has to actually add the double interaction and the triple interaction effects. So in some of the younger cohorts where they were very young, when you add the two effects, they kind of cancel out, and and they are not significant, I believe. In terms of how our paper is different from the two papers in the trade and mobility literature, we talk about our paper being about export expansion through the BTA, as opposed to theirs being on import competition, and we look at gender differences. We also look at both absolute and relative mobility in detail, which those papers do not do. To our knowledge, there's only one paper on with developing countries, the one on India. The other one is on the US. Regarding pre-trend, I have to say that, there is a 1998 different survey with a different methodology and different classification code available. So we didn't do the pre-trend for that reason, but our cohort approach is, a modified substitute for that pre-trend. But when we did the one-digit work earlier, one-digit occupation, we actually checked for pre-trends, and we didn't. The pre-trend check was fine. There was no pre-trend. So I think there might be other issues that I didn't respond to, and there's certainly much more that are very constructive, and we'll certainly take care of those comments.
Yeah. Let's now start with a few. So my quick question is on female labor participation, because I didn't. Maybe you said something about the occupations of the mothers and daughters. Is homemaking an occupation, or the women that are, at home are not part of your sample? But let's take a few more questions before answering.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm not too familiar with the literature itself, but if I understood you correctly, introducing the gender dimension is a novel element in your paper, right? But what I didn't understand is why for daughters you only look at the mother-daughter pair. You could also imagine a setting where you look at the highest occupation of the parents and then benchmark that occupation to the children. Right, because the father could also be a role model for a daughter, or the mother to the son. Is there a reason not to do that, or did you look into that? Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes. I have a question about the channels, how you disentangle the various channels, and also how do you take into account the fact that Vietnam during the same period did a lot of other things. For example, I don't know whether you're factoring in the duty drawback system, which they fashioned on the Chinese one, and which meant that imports to be used in the production of exports were actually, the tariffs were waived, or they were refunded when the exporting process finished. And the other thing is that during that same period that you're looking at, Vietnam made a lot of investments in the higher education in particular, and so you might be how do you disentangle the effects of all these different, and I'm giving just a few examples, how do you disentangle the effects of all these different things that were done from the effects of the BTA?
Thank you. Any more questions? One more here.
Thank you. My question was about the mechanism section. So I guess education is one part. And I wonder if you looked into how the export boom affected parents depending on the occupation that they actually had, because I'm sure there were some occupations that relatively gained and some that relatively lost through the export boom. And you could imagine that that influences the resources parents have to invest in education, migration, or opportunities for their children. And that could be interesting, maybe an explanation for why we don't see what Kristina mentioned, this move of agricultural families, children out of to better occupations, because they might not have had the resources to educate their children because they were relatively not gaining but losing from the export boom. And that could also explain why relative mobility overall goes down.
You can respond.
I'll start with the first answer to the first question, which was from Anna, which was whether females who are not working are, part of the sample or not, and how do we kind of rank a daughter of a mother who was a homemaker. I don't think that's part of the sample, and we don't classify that, but I think Hoang can say for sure, that's not part of our sample, right? To the extent that, that might, and that's not an occupation in our list of occupations. So obviously we cannot, basically based on our definition of mobility, it wouldn't be captured. So why do we look at mother, daughter only and not mother versus father? Daughter and father. That is because then you have two things going on at the same time. You could have gender discrimination as well as mobility happening at the same time, and we won't be able to separate the two. It could, daughters might not be, earning more or having a better occupation than the father, not because there is lack of mobility, but there could also be gender discrimination. And so we won't be able to answer a question on mobility. Channels like duty drawbacks, Vietnam's investment in higher education, I think these would be a problem if across provinces these were actually correlated with the BTA tariff cuts across those provinces. If these are uncorrelated things, then I don't think it would certainly be interesting to see the effects of these things on mobility. So those are not captured by our empirical analysis, but our empirical analysis would be affected, and we would lose confidence in our empirical analysis if our BTA tariff cuts across provinces were actually correlated with how much education investment there was, education infrastructure investment there was across provinces, how much of the duty drawback, as a weighted average we had across provinces, and all those things. So I cannot think of anything that would believe us to think that, those things are correlated. Then impact of education on parents. Some of the things, impact of BTA on parents, some of the things that we see, like the impact on wage, employment, and so on, and on education, probably not the education part, but at least the wage and the employment is across the entire population, not restricted to sons or daughters, but so that would include parents. To that extent, there is this effect on parents as well. And so given that, high-skilled and medium-skilled parents, their wages are going up, they can afford better education for their children, and that could be another channel for upward mobility.
Thank you. I'm going to ask that if you have other questions, you keep them to the coffee break so that we are not completely derailed in the time. So, Roman, you can go ahead.
This is automatic, right, Anna? Okay, okay. Yeah, I found it. Sorry about that. Okay. So thank you, Anna, and thank you very much to all the organizers. So I'm going to present now a paper about an inputs trade liberalization, and the title of the paper is Complements or Subsidies or Substitutes, Labor Market Effects of Foreign Inputs in Developing Economies, and this is joint work with Juan Muñoz and Leonardo Bonilla from the Colombian Central Bank. So the literature has shown that trade can have a profound impact in local labor markets. For example, all the papers from the China shock have shown that competition from low-wage countries decrease employment in developed ones. And we can find similar studies in developing countries. So in particular, input liberalization can affect negatively employment and salaries. So for example, this paper by Discussant and Kovac in Brazil. However, there cannot be net job losses because of labor relocation. And in this context, it is very important to understand what is the impact on the labor market that is coming from a competition shock versus an input shock. But most of the literature that have considered like roundabout production functions, they usually use Cobb-Douglas production function in which labor and intermediate inputs are not substitutes and complements, and this substitutability or complementarity can have some effects on the impact of trade on local labor markets. For instance, in today's presentation, KMU's production function actually was a Cobb-Douglas, in which labor and intermediate inputs were not substitutes and complements. Then there is a second question, which is like where there are differences in this elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediate inputs across sectors, or where the effect is homogeneous across sectors, because this difference can actually amplify the effects that trade can have. And then there are some new papers by author Don and Hanson that has studied how good is the fit of these quantitative models when we compare like the predictions of the model with the data. And what they have found is that the wage dispersion that we observe in the data is much bigger than the wage dispersion that the quantitative models predict. So in some sense, like thinking about mechanisms in which we can make that wage dispersion larger can help us reconcile the models with the data. So what this paper is going to do is we're going to study the impact of an input liberalization in Colombia. In particular, we're going to answer these questions and how does the penetration of goods from foreign countries affect labor markets in developing ones. And we want to separate the effect of a competition versus input shock, but focusing more on this substitutability or complementarity channel. What is our contribution? So in terms of the theory in the quantitative model, we're going to extend the framework from Caliendo, Dworkin, and Parro, and we're going to allow for different degrees of substitutability in the production function. So instead of having a Cobb-Douglas in the production function, we're going to have a CES, and of course the goal is to recover some of those parameters of that production function and how different they are across sectors. Where in the quantitative model, we're going to use a first-order approximation to analyze the impact of trade on labor markets under this setting. And that first-order approximation is the one that is going to guide our empirical strategy. Then, in terms of the empirics, we're going to exploit exogenous variation from two reforms in Colombia to estimate the labor market effects of this input trade liberalization. We're going to use highly administrative data, and we're going to separate the effect between a competition and an input shock at the state sector level. So our unit of observation here is going to be the state sector. And then, because these differences across sectors can be important, we're going to explore heterogeneity by one-digit sector. And finally, in the last part of the paper, we're going to combine the quantitative model with empirics. We're going to map the theory to the data. We're going to recover those main elasticities, and we're going to run several counterfactuals to understand what is the impact of having this substitutability and complementarity channel on the impact that trade has on local labor markets. Okay, so that was the slide of what we do. Here is the slide of what we find. So what we find. When we extend the trade models to allow for this substitutability between labor and intermediate inputs, and we use this first-order approximation, we find that an increase in the trade cost of inputs can actually lead to an expansion in labor. In traditional models, because the production function is Cobb-Douglas, this effect is always negative. And here it can be positive, and the effect is going to depend on the substitutability or complementarity channel. And second, and this is very consistent with the trade theory, an increase in the trade cost to foreign firms is going to increase employment in the local labor markets. Then, from the empirical part, we're going to find that consistent with the theory, the competition shock is going to be negative and the input shock is positive. But that positive input shock is going to be driven by the service sector. But in the manufacturing and the primary sector, we're going to find null effects or actually positive effects. What this suggests is that labor and intermediate inputs are not actually a Cobb-Douglas production function, they are actually substitutes. And this can have some effects in the impact that trade can generate on local labor markets. And then we are going to use those estimates that we found in the reduced form, and the model calibration is going to suggest relevant implications for welfare and employment. And in particular, there are going to be bigger differences in the evolution of employment between services and manufacturing. We're going to find small effects in overall inequality, and the reason is because this substitutability channel is going to decrease inequality across within sectors, but it's going to increase inequality across sectors. So in the end, the two terms cancel each other. And there we're going to find, because there are going to be substitutes in the manufacturing sector, important welfare effects for the manufacturing sector. Okay, so let me jump to a theoretical framework. So the model environment is, think about like a standard trade model. It's Caliendo, Orkin, and Parro. So I'm going to describe first the demand, and then I'm going to go to the supply. So in terms of the demand, there are going to be like multiple regions in Colombia, and there are going to be 2 additional regions, which are going to be the rest of the world and the US. And there are going to be also multiple sectors, including a home production sector. The preferences for the different goods are going to be Cobb-Douglas. So these expenditure shares are going to be fixed across markets. And we are going to assume the standard Eaton-Accorton assumption. So the trade elasticity is going to be constant, and it is just going to be described by this theta over here. And all income is going to be devoted to consumption, so there is not going to be accumulation of capital in the model. So what is the big change relative to the literature? We're going to use a CS production function instead of a Cobb-Douglas production function. So our interest is going to be to calibrate in some way this elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediate inputs. And these parameters zeta are going to measure like the relative efficiency of each one of the inputs of labor or the intermediate inputs. Usually in most traditional trade models, the sigmas are equal to 1. And if they are equal to 1, like these production functions goes to the Cobb-Douglas production function. Then in terms of the market structure, it is like a classic trade model. So we're going to assume like perfect competition with iceberg trade cost. This is the functional form that you get for the price index. And we're also going to assume that the intermediate inputs are going to be a CES composite input, and this with elasticity delta. We can also assume Cobb-Douglas in this lower nest, but just to be consistent, we are assuming that CES production function. And importantly, like in most trade models, all sectors and final consumers are going to face the same price index in the destination. Okay. So I'm not going to go over all the model. I'm just going to describe like the market clearing condition from the labor demand side. So basically, this is going to be the total expenditure that is going to be decomposed into terms. One is like the part that is going to intermediate inputs, which is like this part that you find here. And then you have like the second part, which is the part that goes to final consumers. You can always solve this, you can always solve this model. These are like the trade share predicted by Eaton and Cortum. They depend negatively on the trade cost, and that's the parameter that we want to change. And the important thing is that the labor market clearing, which is like the total wage bill, Now it's going to have this labor share multiplied by the gross production, but this labor share is not longer constant. The labor share can be affected by changes in trade costs and by changes in productivities and so on. And finally, because we are studying like this trade liberalization episode, it is important to take into account like the revenue that is coming from the distortions. So in the final demand of consumers, we are taking into account the revenue that is coming from the different tariffs. Okay, so that was the labor demand side. Now for the labor supply, we are going to follow the same structure of Caliendo, Orkin, and Parro, and Artuk, Chowdhury, and McLaren. And in particular, we are going to assume that agents can move across sectors and across regions. They are going to face some frictions to move across these sectors and across these regions. And because we are going to calibrate the model to the Colombian economy, so we are not that interested in the US and in the rest of the world. So for the US and the rest of the world, there are not going to be regions. There are just going to be 2 locations in that case, and they can only move across sectors. So there is no international migration in the sense that Colombians can move to outside or foreigners can move to Colombia. So as traditional in these models, we're going to assume forward-looking agents, and the utility function is going to be like, it's going to yield like the indirect utility is this measure of real income, which is just the wage divided by the total price index. So here we're going to follow a recent paper, which is Rodriguez, Claire, Ulate, and Vasquez. And in particular, we're going to assume like that there are different elasticities to move across sectors and across regions. This is just assuming that the labor supply elasticity to the sector is different to the migration elasticity. So we're just going to assume that first they are choosing the sector in which they are going to work, which is the first equation over here, and then they are choosing the region in which they are going to live. And the assumption here is that it is easier to move across sectors than across regions. So, and I may be confused here, but I think that nu should be higher than kappa. That will be like the implication of that assumption. So I'm not going to go over how can you solve these models, but basically you can use this method developed by Caliendo, Orkin, and Parro, which is to solve it using dynamic hat algebra. Okay, so this is the important part. So we are interested in understanding how trade cost is going to affect earnings. So we're going to use like the labor market clearing condition from the demand side, in which the total earnings of labor is going to be decomposed into the labor share times the gross production. And here we're going to try to understand what is the impact on total earnings of a change in trade cost. So let's see what happens in the model if we change trade cost. So something important here, I'm assuming that the gammas are constant. So in some sense, no. I'm assuming that the lowerness is Cobb-Douglas. And I'm assuming that many of these other things are constant. So for example, wages are not changing when I'm doing this first order approximation. But when I do the first order approximation, we can decompose the change in earnings. I forgot something. This is the first order approximation is very similar to what Arao, Arkolakis, and Esposito did in their paper. Of course, they are solving it in general equilibrium, so they are taking into account other variables. I'm assuming most of these variables constant here. But when we do this first order approximation, we can decompose the effect into 3 different terms. So the first 2 terms are going to capture like the input shock. How much, because of a change in the trade cost, the marginal cost of Colombian producers is changing. The first effect is going to come from the substitutability and complementarity channel. So usually, in most trade models, because we assume Cobb-Douglas production functions, this sigma is equal to 1. And if that sigma is equal to 1, look that this effect goes away. Now, the second effect is something that I call the marginal cost effect, which is basically if the tariffs of your inputs increases, then the marginal cost of producing 1 unit is going to increase. And if that marginal cost increases, you are going to lose participation in other markets, so the labor is going to contract in that particular industry and region. The parameter that is going to govern that change in the marginal cost is the trade elasticity. And that's the reason because here we have a negative coefficient. So look that if we are like in the traditional trade model in which there is no substitutability or complementarity, just the second term appears from the input shock. So it will always predict that the input shock is going to have a negative effect on the total wage bill. And the third term over here is what I call the import competition shock, which basically suggests that when there is more competition, when there is less competition, I'm doing here an increasing trade cost. So when there is less competition, the labor in that particular sector and region is going to expand, and it's going to be governed, but also by the trade elasticity. So the goal here is to try to understand the overall effect and to calibrate some of these sigmas, and then run some counterfactuals, changing those sigmas and comparing that with the Cobb-Douglas production function. So now I'm going to go to empirics. So for the empirics, we're going to exploit two reforms that are like Colombian tariff reduction for input. So one is going to be the free trade agreement between the Colombia and the US. This is different to the free trade agreement between the Vietnam and the US, in the sense that the one in Vietnam and the US, it was an export trade liberalization. This is an input trade liberalization. And the main interest was to reduce the price of inputs and increase the participation of Colombian firms in international trade. So there are like two tariff decreases. One is a unilateral tariff decrease in 2010. This was like because of a change in the government and because of changes in the exchange rate. So we're going to argue that this shock is also unanticipated. And the second one is the free trade agreement between the Colombia and the US. It was mainly affected manufacturing products, and it was a progressive decrease in some agricultural goods. Neither of them affected Colombian export, and if they did, it was like very, very little. So these are like what are like the two reforms that we're going to study. One is the one in 2010, the other one is the one in 2012. So we can see that like in one-digit sectors, there is a big decrease in tariffs. So for example, for agricultural sectors, it came from 13% to almost 2%, or to lower than 2%, and similar for manufacturing and mining. And from the US perspective, like the US tariff charged to Colombian producers, they were already very low because Colombia is a very important partner for the US in the region. And because of the war against drugs, Colombia was already receiving some preferential treatments in the US markets. So as you can see, there was a small decrease, but the tariffs were already lower than 2%, or the average tariffs were already lower than 2%. So this is an input trade liberalization, not an export trade liberalization, and that makes it different to the US one. So we are going to argue that the tariff decreases were unanticipated. The first one in 2010, it was a response to depreciation of the exchange rate, and basically many inputs for Colombian firms were getting too expensive, so these firms were losing participation in international market. So the government announced like a general reduction of tariffs after they came into the office. The other one is the free trade agreement with the US. So at the time, so the free trade agreement was signed between the two countries in 2006, but in that moment, Colombia was a very violent country, and there were like many concerns about human rights violation and the safety of Colombian labor leaders. So the Democratic Party here in the US didn't want to sign the agreement until Colombia basically solved the issue. But in October 2011, the Republican Party made a big push in the Congress. So the agreement was finally approved, and they made like this big push because like most of the governments in Latin America or around Colombia were from the left, not from the right. And then for them was important to have like an ally in the region. Okay, so those are like the two reforms that we're going to use. In order to understand the impact on labor markets, we're going to combine like multiple sources of data. So first, we're going to use the match employer-employee monthly recording data. With this, we can observe like formal employment across different regions and sectors in the Colombian economy. We're going, because we know that informality is a big issue in developing countries, we're going to complement our data with Colombian household surveys. And then we're going to use like information from the customs data that we're going to aggregate at the state year industry level, but we're going to exploit that variation in Colombian trade to construct like input shocks. We're going to use like two tariff decreases and this record of imports by firms, which is basically costume data that we aggregate at the state year industry level. And for the model, we're going to use like regional input-output matrices from the Colombian Central Bank. So we are going to aggregate the data from 400 sectors to only two-digit industries when we do the calibration of the model. And the reason is because these regional input-output matrices, we only can find them at the two-digit sector level, not at the four-digit sector level. So for our empirical strategy, we are going to use this data set from 2008 to 2018, and we are going to use the unit of observation is going to be the year industry or the year industry state level. So we play around like with the two sets of observation. Okay, so what is the impact of the trade liberalization on earnings? So we're going to build two shocks, and this is part of to analyze the trade liberalization episode. So the first one is going to be the competition shock, which is just the decrease in the tariff. So this tau should be 1 plus. I just realized that this is 1 plus the tariff. And then for the input shock, we're going to construct a Bartik shock, in which the shares are going to be the shares that each industry is using from each other industry from the import records. And the shifter is going to be the change in the tariff of this sector K. So this is just a measure of exposure on how much the price of inputs is decreasing because of the trade liberalization episode. We're going to have industry fixed effects, state fixed effect, and then we're going to weight the decrease in the tariffs of imported inputs. Yeah, this is going to be the input shock. Okay. Then we're going to run like two-way fixed effects and event study specification. The idea is to separate like what the input shock versus the competition shock. So our main regression is going to have the competition shock and the input shock, and we're interested in these parameters beta C and beta I. In many specifications, we're going to include a state time fixed, sorry, I forgot, sorry, a state time fixed effect, a state sector fixed effect. In some of them, we also include a sector time fixed effect, and we're also going to include like a vector characteristics interacted with time fixed effect. We also estimate the event study specification to check for parallel trends, and the treatment here is like the difference in tariffs between 2018 and 2010, and for the input shock is the same difference, but with the weights that I just showed you in the shift share instrument. Okay, so this is like the effect that tariff reductions have on total imports. So you can think about this as a first stage. So it's the impact of the trade liberalization on imports. And what we can observe is that a 1% decrease in tariff is going to decrease tariffs, is going to decrease imports by 1.4%. So this goes in line with the literature. We separate the effect between the US and non-US imports, and what we find is that US is gaining participation in Colombian imports over other countries. Okay, and this is what happens to labor markets. So this is like the main figure of the paper. So here we have like what is the evolution of employment across the different cells. So the blue line represents the cells that didn't experience a tariff reduction. The red line represents the cells that experience a competition tariff reduction. And what we can observe here is that the employment for the industries and states that experience this competition tariff reduction basically decrease. So you can see that the blue line stays constant while there is a big change in the trend of the red line. So like this competition channel, it's a negative effect. So labor markets contracted in the industries that experience that tariff reduction. And then we have the input shock. So it's the same figure, but then we have the ones that didn't experience like the input price reduction, which is going to be the blue line, and the one that experienced the input price reduction. So we observed that the trends were similar before the shock, and then after the shock, the ones that didn't experience the input price reduction contracted a little bit, while the one that experienced an input price reduction expanded. this is jointly estimated, like the two shocks are together. Then I will go to the controls and so on, so some of these effects are going to be a little bit lower, but it's jointly estimated, the two of them. Yes? Yeah, so we have like a primary sector. So if you go back to this figure, some of the agricultural sectors, so the ones that are in blue, this blue line, they also experience some tariff changes. So it was like the manufacturing sector experienced like the trade liberalization, but also like some agricultural goods experienced that as well. And it was like similar in magnitude. It's not that the manufacturing was more affected than the agricultural ones. Okay. Then, sorry. So this is like the main figure. Then we run the event studies. So here we find parallel trends, and the competition shock is positive. The coefficient is positive because remember, this is an increase in tariff. So in the same way that Devashish was interpreting the coefficient, a positive coefficient here means a negative effect. So the competition shock is negative, while the input shock is positive. Here, because I'm including more controls, like we lose some significance after the fact. Okay, now we go to our main regression, which is like the two-way fixed effect. And here we're separating like the input and competition shock. Of course, this is jointly estimated. And what we find is that the input shock is negative. A 1% decrease in the price of inputs is going to increase the wage bill by 1%. And a 1% increase in the tariffs is going to increase the labor earnings by 2%. So we find like this is a very robust exercise across like different sets of fixed effect. We also run like a two-stage least square, in which like usually the theory suggests that when you sign a free trade agreement, tariffs should go to zero. In many cases, tariffs do not go to zero because there is lobby and because there are many things. So we also run this two-stage least square, in which we basically assume that what will have happened if tariffs go to zero. So the instrument is if tariffs go to zero, and the x variable is the same x variable that we had before. And we find like larger effects in this case, so we find that the competition shock is actually 3% instead of 2%, but the effects are similar. Okay, but part of our analysis was interested in exploring like heterogeneity across like one-digit sectors. So in this panel B, we separate the effect between agriculture, manufacturing, and services, and for the competition shock, we separated between agriculture and manufacturing. And what we find is that the input shock is actually positive for agriculture or zero for manufacturing, while most of the effect is driven by the service sector. So the interpretation of this result is that labor and intermediate inputs are like substitutes in the agricultural and manufacturing sector, and they are like, and we don't know about the service sector. It can go in any direction. And for the competition shock, we find like more positive effects for agriculture. And this suggests that maybe the trade elasticity is higher for agricultural goods than manufacturing goods, but we're going to confirm that later in the structural estimation. Okay, so what are the takeaways on the empirics? So there is, consistent with the theory, there is a negative impact of the input shock and a positive impact of the competition shock. And there is higher competition effect in the primary sector over the manufacturing one. And the input shock is driven by the service sector, which suggests that in the primary and manufacturing sector, goods and intermediate, labor and intermediate inputs are substitute. Okay, so I will go for the model calibration. So we're going to calibrate the model. So the regressions were run at the state 4-digit sector cell, but we cannot find all the data that we need at that level. And because we cannot find all that data, we're going to start aggregating some of the sectors. So we're going to calibrate the model for 14 sectors. You can think about this as 2-digit sectors and a home production sector. We're going to include like 3 primary sectors, 8 manufacturing sectors, and 2 service sectors. We're going to calibrate the model for 24 regions in Colombia, plus 2 other regions. One is going to be the US, and the other one is going to be the rest in the world. So there are going to be 26 regions in totals. And there is only migration within the Colombian state, so there is no like international migration. And very important for the model, we're going to transform the transition matrix to start in steady states, because at least for me, it is very difficult to solve the model if we do not start from a steady state. We're going to complement the data with the world input-output database to compute trade flows between the US and the rest of the world, and with these regional input-output tables that give us like the whole matrix for the Colombian economy. What do you mean? Sorry. You mean like there's migration within Colombia? Across, yeah. Across the states, yeah, across the states. Okay. Then we need to estimate some parameters. Of course, we can use the trade elasticity that people have estimated before. I think that people use Simonovsky and WAF. But we are going to have a trade liberalization. We're going to record the trade elasticity ourselves. So we just basically run a gravity equation using the change in the tariffs, comparing the imports that are coming from the US versus the imports that are coming from the rest of the world, and the change in the tariffs. And then we're going to recover the key elasticity of substitution in the production function using directly a point estimate. So there is no estimation of those parameters. There is just a simple calibration using that first order approximation. Okay, so these are like the trade elasticities. We estimate the trade elasticities at the 2-digit sector level. So for the aggregate one, we found 3, which I think that goes in line with Simonovsky and WAC. And it goes in line with the recent estimate by Levchenko. And then in terms of the agricultural and manufacturing one, like consistent with our empirical results, we find a higher trade elasticity in the agricultural sector than in the manufacturing sector. And then when we break out this by 2-digit industries, you know, it goes like in some cases, it is a reasonable number. In our case, it is not a reasonable number, but I think that from this table, it is very similar to some of the estimates in the literature. Yes, ma'am.
Have you programmed the wage put into the WDL, or is that just not?
We did some data at the beginning. I do not have those results in the paper, but most of the effects were coming from the employment more than the wage. But we can do that. I mean, it's just the average wage times and then have the total employment. We can do that. Yes, like in this equation, like the equation that I'm estimating, is just a gravity equation in which I'm relating trade flows to a change in the tariffs, and I'm exploiting the free trade agreement between the Colombia and the US versus the rest of the world. Yeah, so mine is in between. It's 3. Sorry, what? I'm in the middle of both, but yeah, I agree that one of Levchenko is too low and the other one may be too high. But yeah, I'm in the middle, so I'm consistent. Let's put it that way. Okay, so this was like the effect. Like this was just estimating the trade elasticity. I think. So here we're using the data from 2008 to 2018, and this free trade agreement was in 2012. So we have 4 years before and 6 years after the trade agreement. Yes, actually, I have been working in estimating trade elasticities in another project using like free trade agreements across the world, and like the estimates are, I mean, they are very messy. I was surprised that this worked relatively well. Okay, these are like the trade elasticities, but we're more interested in the calibration of the elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediate inputs. So from that first order approximation that I showed at the beginning, we know that if this beta is positive, we know that the substitution effect is going to dominate the marginal cost effect, so we can conclude that they are substitutes. If the beta of the input shock is equal to 0, the substitution effect is going to dominate the marginal cost effect, so they are substitutes. And then if beta is lower than 0, we know that the marginal cost can dominate, or they can be complements, so we don't know what happens with labor and intermediate inputs. But using the first order approximation, the trade elasticities and the coefficient that we estimate from the reduced form, we can recover the elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediate inputs by basically solving this very simple equation. So we have all the information that is in red, we have all the information that is at the left-hand side, so we can recover sigma j. And more or less, the sigma j's that we get is like 2.5 in agriculture, 2.5 in manufacturing, and like 0.2 to services. So this suggests that labor and intermediate inputs are substitutes in manufacturing and agriculture, and they are complements in the service sectors. Then we can use a Cobb-Douglas production function in the lower nest, but we use like an estimate from Peter and Ruan. So Alessandra Peter has a paper that study what is the impact of not the elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediate inputs, but just across inputs. And she finds that this can generate like large effects in the gains from trade. And they calibrated that parameter for the Indian economy, and they found 2, so we're going to use that too. And then for the inverse elasticity to move across regions and across sectors, we're going to use the estimates from Rodriguez, Claire, Ulati, and Vasquez. And for the trade elasticity, we're just using the average that we find, which is 3. Then, based on these parameters, we can basically solve the model and run our counterfactuals, and we are going to analyze the labor market effects of the reform on the evolution of employment, impacts in the labor share, and change in the welfare. And the definition of welfare here is going to follow like the definition from Irhan and co-authors, which is like the net present value of real income and all the mobility options. So it takes into account the outside options that individuals have. So these are like the effects in terms of the evolution of employment. So we can see that when you allow for the, so just to be clear, the solid lines represent the case of the Cobb-Douglas production function. The dotted lines represent the case of the CES production function. So we can see that there are going to be bigger differences when we compare like the, sorry, I think that I did it wrongly. So the solid line is the CES, and the dotted line is the Cobb-Douglas. So we can see when we compare the CES with the Cobb-Douglas, the differences are bigger. So for example, the service sectors in the case of the, on the CES case increased by 2% in terms of the change in the total workforce. And there is a big decrease in the case of the Cobb-Douglas because in one sector they are complements and the other sector they are services. We can also observe that the effect is bigger for the manufacturing sector, and the reason is because they are using more intermediate inputs. So those exposure measured already to the input shock are bigger for the manufacturing sector than for other sectors. And in the case of the agricultural sector, it is going to generate an effect, but in terms of percentage point, it is not going to be as big as the one in the manufacturing sector. Then you can also do this by each one of the one-digit sectors. So here I just separated between agriculture, forestry, and aquaculture, and the effect is similar in the sense that usually the CES is going to be below the dotted line. The CES, the solid line is usually going to be below the dotted line. Sorry, I got confused. The CES is going to be below the dotted line, and the reason is because they are substitutes in agriculture as well. We can do the same thing for manufacturing. The important thing of manufacturing is that there is going to be a lot of heterogeneity across sectors of this new mechanism, and the reason is because there are some two-digit industries that are using more inputs than others. So the ones that are using more inputs, initially, they are going to be more exposed to a shock than the ones that were not using as many inputs initially. So for example, in the case of metal, it can have a huge effect. It can go from 6% in the CS case versus just 4% in the Cobb-Douglas case. And for services, the change in employment is going to be bigger. Now, there is a large literature that has focused on the impact on what happens to a labor share. We believe that, I mean, I'm not an expert on that literature and I don't know much, but we believe that this mechanism, can explain some of the patterns. People have said about concentration, markups, and so on, but this substitutability or complementarity channel can have some impact in the labor share. And here, for example, we see that trade can have an impact in the labor share. For example, for metals and machinery, it can decrease the labor share by 1%. Okay, and I will just finish with this. What are the welfare gains with the trade liberalization? So overall, there is not a big impact of having a CES production function versus a Cobb-Douglas production function. So the gains from trade are similar in the two cases, are like 0.8% of real income. But for the primary sector, and especially for the manufacturing sector, there is a big decrease in welfare, especially for manufacturing. The average welfare gain in the Cobb-Douglas case is 0.37%, while in the CES production case is only 0.17%. So there can be a huge effect on welfare in the manufacturing sector. And in terms of inequality, you can see that inequality doesn't change that much across all industries, but for the primary sector and for the manufacturing sector, it actually decreases. So inequality within these two sectors decreases when we have the CES case versus the Cobb-Douglas case. And this is just the same figure, like a figure showing like what are the welfare effects by industry. And we can see that the manufacturing sector is the one that is most affected when we include like this CES production function instead of the Cobb-Douglas. So let me conclude. We exploit this recent trade liberalization episode in Colombia. We separate the effect between an import competition shock and a foreign input shock that have opposite effects on employment. But when we estimate one-digit coefficients, we find that labor and inputs are substituted in the manufacturing and primary sector. We extend the dynamic general equilibrium model from CDP and Artuk, Chowdhury, and McLaren, and we find that this can have some implication for the evolution of employment and welfare. So thank you very much. Looking forward to your comments.
All right. How do I expand this? Control, what? Control L. All right. Okay. So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to discuss this paper. It really made me think a lot about topics that I care about, and it was interesting to. I learned a lot from the paper, and okay. Let me start with a brief summary of the paper. This paper addresses a very important question in trade. What are the effects of trade liberalization on labor markets? And basically, the argument of the paper is that we have two different effects. On the one hand, we have the import competition effect. The country that is going through a trade liberalization, there will be a reduction in the prices. The firms, local firms, are going to have to face this increasing in the import competition. And that will always have a negative impact on the labor demand from those industries that are disproportionately affected by this. On the other hand, we have also a foreign input price. When you have this trade liberalization, those firms now, they have access. They are benefited by having access to those intermediate inputs from abroad. And that turns out to have ambiguous impact on labor demand, and this is the point of the paper. So on the one hand, yes, you have the access to those intermediate inputs that allows you to reduce the marginal cost. It reduces the prices. There will be increasing the quantities demanded, and ultimately an increase in the demand for labor. But on the other hand, the price of those intermediate inputs are going to fall relative to labor. And that the extent to which that's going to increase or decrease the demand for labor now depends on the technology of these firms. So if labor and intermediate inputs are complementary, then this is only going to increase the demand for labor. But if they are substitutes, now you see all those cheap inputs, and you're just going to use even more of those inputs instead of using the labor. It turns out that this second mechanism is muted with the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is what most of us are using in the literature. So I think that it's interesting to see what are the implications of relaxing this particular assumption in the models. So how do they answer this question? They are going to bring this impressive data from Colombia with custom data, employer-employee information, tariff decrease. They put all of that together, and then they provide some new reduced farm evidence, and they're going to quantify a trade and migration model with CES technology. Okay. And then what do they find? They find in the reduced farm results that yes, the import competition reduces employment, but these foreign input prices increases employment in average, but the results are going to be very heterogeneous across industries. And that seems to be a signal that the substitution effect is important for us to understand the data. And then when they go to the quantitative model, they look at the CES specification versus Covey-Douglas, and they find very large implications for labor allocation, somewhat limited implications for the average welfare gain, but again, there are some important heterogeneous effects in terms of welfare. So how do I see the contribution of this paper? Look, there is a big literature on the effects of trade liberalization, on labor markets and the impact of access to foreign inputs. But there is a subset of papers that are focusing more on the development of those quantitative trade models to think about the distribution and aggregate effects of those shocks. So I see this paper as closer to this particular subset of the literature. There is this very nice paper recently that looks at the impact of trade liberalization in India and the role of substitutability between labor and intermediate inputs. So this paper is entering the fray here by providing some new reduced form evidence, focusing on this intermediate input side. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the first paper to really look at the implications of CS technology in this class of models that we are using a lot, the dynamic quantitative trade model, the Caliendo de Verkin-Paro, and then Artuk Chodhary McLaren Hoang is here. So I will have two comments, one in each one. I think they are more like clarification comments, but I hope they will make the contributions of the paper stronger. So first, let me go through the heterogeneous effects. This turns out to be an important part of the paper. So they run this regression. On the dependent variable, we have the labor employment, and then we have two explanatory variables here. We have the part competition effect, and we have also the intermediate input shock, okay, which is captured by the second component. And then it turns out that the heterogeneity in this beta I across different sectors is going to be important part of the argument. When I was reading the paper, I think that in the presentation, I think Roman was very clear with this, but let me revisit this. How should we interpret this heterogeneity in beta from the lens of the model? So they derived this very nice first order impact equation for small changes in the trade cost. So reorganizing things just a little bit. First, we have the import competition effect. So how much you're affected on the output side. And you can see that it's going to depend on the demand elasticity. It's going to depend on how important labor share is. And it's also important how exposed. This is a measure of exposure to this reduction in trade costs. And then we have two additional terms. We have the foreign input, the marginal cost. The second thing that also is something about the competition on output side. So you're able to reduce the marginal cost of production, the prices go down, so you're going to be able to sell more. So this is also going to be controlled by some extent to theta J, which is related to the demand curve in the model. And then finally, we have this third term that it's not there in the Covey-Douglas specification. This sigma J is going to be equal to 1. You disappear with this. And notice, this is not on the output side of the economy. It's the input side. Your decisions between labor and intermediate input. So theta J here is not going to appear in this particular equation. Okay? So when we look at this and go back to the reduced form, we see that there is actually many sources of heterogeneity that could be driving those differences in beta. So for example, we have differences in the technology, which is part of the argument of the paper. But we also have differences in the demand. We have differences in how exposed you are to those to this shock. You have differences in the cost share of labor, in the cost share of inputs. And also there is something I couldn't really tell from the paper, but even there may be some misspecification of the shock from the lens of the model, because we do not observe the trade of a sector with itself. And so, and we know that in the input-output matrix, we have a heavy diagonal, which might be influencing the results. So all of those things, I think that as you discuss those results in the paper, it would be nice to have a closer discussion using the analytical results, and maybe center the discussion of the robustness around some of those points. So if you consider this sorts of heterogeneity, these sorts of heterogeneity, it does the mechanism that I'm trying to highlight, which is the elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediate input, still going to be there. So for example, one of the arguments of the paper is this beta is larger than 0. For example, for the agricultural sector. And for me, it was not entirely clear if this would still hold if we consider all of those sources of heterogeneity. It might hold or it might not, but I think it would be useful to discuss this more in the paper. So the second thing is related to the output and the quantitative model. I thought that this figure was very interesting. So when you look at the differences between the Cobb-Douglas and the CS, there are very large implications for the labor allocation. For example, the solid line here is the implications for labor allocation in the manufacturing sector when you have a CS production function. So the effects are more than twice as large if you're using the CS relative to the Cobb-Douglas. And this is also going to be very large in agriculture. So I was thinking about, as a development economist, that this has very important implications for structural change, how we think about that. And that's something that became even more important after the presentations in the morning. So, and the paper highlights a lot the effects on welfare, which is great. I think that is important. This is the typical measure of welfare that we have in those models. We have the change in real wage, but we also have to adjust this by the fact that you can migrate to other regions of the economy. So the other regions might also be benefiting, and so you have to take that into account. But I think that would be interesting to look at other outcomes that are more closely associated with this substitutability mechanism, because the welfare is going to capture a bunch of things that are related to the demand factors that are not necessarily directly related to the CS versus Cobb-Douglas choice. So one thing that I thought it would be interesting to see some measures of labor productivity. And here, there are other papers with this. I just thought it was easier to cite my own paper because we just did this this year. So we have some measures of labor productivity. Ahmad and I and Farid, Ahmad, who is going to discuss tomorrow. I think it would be interesting to discuss a bit more the changes in the cost share of workers, like what are the differences in the baseline. There is a very brief discussion, and also revisit the analytical results with the quantified model. You could look at these three different mechanisms and look at what is the relative importance of those three mechanisms when you have a small change in the tariff. So, okay, so I'm already over time. So I think this is a very important addition to the literature. It has important implications for labor allocation. I thought as a development economist that has very interesting implications for the discussions about deindustrialization, structural change, trade, and I'm looking forward to reading the new versions of the paper.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Roman, if you want to do some quick responses.
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much, Heitor, for those great comments. So regarding the first one, it is difficult to construct exactly like the exposure measure that is in the first order approximation, but I agree with you that we should do a better work in trying to interpret as beta I. Part of that, I think, is that the first order approximation is based on the fact that it's assuming that the change in the trade cost is very small. And when we run the counterfactuals, like many things are going on. So I saw your last comment. I don't think that you mentioned it, but I think that it is important to simulate, like in the model, like very small changes in the trade costs to see if we can replicate some of the results of the reduced form. But let me say that I completely agree that it is important to look at which channels survive once we start like thinking about that heterogeneity of the beta I. So we will definitely think about it. We have always tried, something that we have tried is to run like similar regressions with the model as the ones that we have in the data. The problem with that is that at the 2-digit sector level, we have like less power, but we can try to do some approach to better match that foreign input shock because the exposure is different to the one that we're constructing in the reduced form. So I completely agree with that. And in terms of the output and employment, let me say that I was raised as a person to focus a lot on welfare, so because that was my advisors do. But I agree with you that it is important to look at other margins, like for example the labor cost share That's the reason because I also added like the labor share in the slides. I think that there is a literature that just focus on the labor share, and I do not study in particular what drives the labor share. But I don't know if they have thought about these mechanisms, but I think that this substitutability or complementarity matters. There is a similar paper, not a similar paper, there is another paper by Federico, what's the name of the guy from Toronto? There is that with Federico and Erne, what's the name? I forgot. But Federico Neus has a paper in which they are also looking at the elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediate inputs. The context is different because they are using like data from Chile in which they have all the transaction data. But it shows the importance of this mechanism in terms of other outcomes. And definitely we will look at those outcomes like the cost share of workers and so on. So thank you very much for those comments. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have some minutes to take questions. Just use the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for the excellent paper, very timely. So I have a quick question. Actually, Hater asked partially. So if you have like a input-output matrix, the diagonal is clearly the largest elements are on the diagonal. So if you include the diagonal in the calculation of the cost, then it is correlated with the price of the same sector. So then your results will be downward biased. But if you eliminate them and calculate the input price excluding that, then maybe it is you are not capturing the whole effect. So how do you deal with that? That's the question. Thanks.
Let's take.
But okay, sounds good.
Hi, I'm over here. I'm over here. So just a clarifying question and then a comment. The clarifying question is the whole dynamic labor thing, the Erhan thing. Where is that showing up in the estimation of the input elasticities? I'd missed that. And then the suggestion is, as you know, in this whole trade elasticity estimation literature, now there are increasing number of papers that distinguish between a short run and long run elasticity. And you can imagine on this input substitution a similar thing. And the reason why I mention that is, there's that earthquake paper by Nitya and Chris and Aaron, and they, find that they were essentially complements and big complements, like an elasticity close to zero. But, they were looking at very short run effects. So just wanted to throw that out there.
So Kim just asked what I was going to ask, but better. So I'll shut up.
So we can take another one.
Hi, very impressive work. Thank you for your presentations. I just have a couple of comment, but feel free to disregard it. I just happened to encounter this trade episode, and I wonder if you could say, wonder if there's any anticipation effect before the trade episode, because I remember that the agreement was the negotiations start a little bit earlier, 2006, and then it, I think, come into effect in 2007, and then US approved it in 2011. So I wonder if you have any of that in the reduced form. The other thing is that I agree with Hater, the comment in the sense that I think there could be, if it is CS, then there's elasticity of substitution that is different from cup glass. Maybe a useful exercise to check is to check heterogeneity effect based on the level of input share, or the level of it, or the input share. It would shed light on whether that a little bit more complement or substitutions. And the third one is related to input-output metric and related to some of the questions. So generally, I feel like in this literature, input tariffs, when they calculate this, a little bit aggregate. Usually, you can only get it a 2-digit or so. I think one way you can get around it is use the 2-digit level input-output table, and say take a chronicle product with the 4-digit one. If you have a 4-digit, because you have a 4-digit data, so you layer the 4-digit into within the 2-digit, and that would help you to capture the broad aggregate input-output, but also have more information that you can exploit for digit, but feel free to disregard because it's just my thoughts. Thanks.
So I'm going to start in reverse order. So thank you for the comment about like transforming or using the variation at the 4-digit instead of the 2-digit because of the input-output matrix. I think that even with that, it will be more difficult to solve like this model, like with 400 industries, that with just 14 industries. So there is a trade-off there that I will need to analyze if it is worth it to do it or not. In terms of the input shares, we have the issue that now we only observe like for the at the 4-digit we only observe like the import. So we do not observe the domestic part, and we construct like the shock based on the import. We still have like a very diagonal that it's very large, but we have the problem that at least for the reduced form, we only observe the imports, we don't observe the domestic part. And finally, in terms of the anticipation effect and the negotiations, I mean, it is, of course, they can anticipate how much the tariffs will be reduced. What we exploit here and what we argue that this exogenous is the timing of the shock, because like it was not expected to be approved in 2011. And in some people in Colombia, they expected that it was not going to be signed given the problems with the labor leaders at the moment. So it's more like the exogenous, the timing is the exogenous part more than the change in the tariffs. That's what we argue in the paper. Going back to Keimu's point, okay, the first question about like where the dynamic part appears in the reduced form, the answer is that it doesn't. So that first order approximation is based on the labor demand. That first order approximation is not based on the labor supply, and the dynamic part is the labor supply. What of course, like it is a first order approximation, and it is how much the labor demand is changing. Of course, when we are solving like the full model, we're taking into account like everything, and we're taking into account how people respond to wages. So we have that in the model, but not in the first order approximation. The second question, I think that, you know, it is very important to estimate these days like the short run and the long run elasticities, not only the one in trade, but in general. I think that we're estimating like a medium-term elasticity in the sense that we are exploiting variation of 10 years. We cannot say that this is a long-run trade elasticity, but not a short-run short-run elasticity. So we're like in between. I agree with you that it is important to estimate that, but I don't think that with just one country and just one reform, we have enough variation to estimate like the way that Levchenko did it, like they estimated like using variation for several countries. And then the case of Irhan, actually I wanted to ask you like a clarification question to your question. When you say about that diagonal matrix, you were talking about more about the reduced form, or you were asking more about like how do we do it in the model part? Okay, so for the reduced form, I mean, we haven't explored that, and maybe it's something that we need to explore. But for the reduced form, because we are like running the regressions at the 4-digit sector level, what we do is we are doing it with imports. So we do not have the domestic part. I haven't, you know, removed the diagonal, like how much you are using from the same sector that you are in. But it's something that we can do and see how much our result change when we change that diagonal matrix.
Thank you very much. Because we're already late, I'm going to take a unilateral decision, if my co-organizers don't mind, which is to move the next session by 15 minutes, so we can still benefit from, I know, conversations during coffee break are important. So if we can all come back at 3:45, of course, I hope the presenters and discussants of the next session don't mind, but let's do that.